Hello, my name is Edwin Rutsch, and I'm the director of the Empathy Center located here in beautiful Santa Barbara, California. The center's mission is to build the empathy movement and to raise the level of empathy in society through education and community building initiatives.
And my name is Anita Nowak. I teach at McGill University, and I'm the author of Purposeful Empathy, a book that invites readers to turn up the volume of empathy in their lives.
And at the beginning of 2024, Anita and I co-hosted the Empathy Summit, brought to you by the Empathy Center, and more than 40 authors of books about empathy participated.
They shared what their book was about, why they were motivated to write it, and what they hope readers will take away. Thank you so much for watching, and we hope you'll buy their book.
We're getting ready for our participants then, and our first speaker is Simon Baron-Cohen. So pleased to have Simon here. And Simon is a professor of development psychopathology and director of the Autism Research Center and a fellow at the Trinity College. And he is the author of 0 Degrees of Empathy, a new theory of human cruelty and kindness. He's been a long time, has studied empathy for quite a long time. So the floor is yours, Simon. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure, and I'm going to try and share my slides. Let's put it onto full screen. Can you all see that okay? That's great. So
yes.
I'm speaking to you from Cambridge in England, and it's a pleasure to participate in this important summit. You can see the title of my book was 0 Degrees of Empathy. It's now about 10 years old, but I started studying empathy to try to understand human cruelty. And we don't really need many examples of human cruelty, but I'll just give you a couple. You know, this is Sergio de Simone, who was a 7-year-old boy who was in Auschwitz during the Holocaust, and he was taken to participate in an experiment by this doctor, Dr. Kurt Heismeyer. And the experiment was called the Neugamma experiment, where this doctor injected tuberculosis into 20 children as part of scientific medical experiment, just to see what would happen. And after his experiment, he murdered the children to hide the evidence. So the Holocaust is just one example of extremes of cruelty by humans, where other people, in this case a child, are treated as if they are mere objects without emotions. We can just point to one other example, which was a generation earlier, the Kishinev pogrom, where Jewish communities were attacked, children were killed, women were raped, ordinary communities were murdered. And it just raises a big question: what causes human cruelty? So in my book, I explore this idea of empathy and the erosion of empathy as a cause of human cruelty. We all have empathy, and as a scientist, I divide empathy into at least 2 components: cognitive empathy, which is the ability to recognize someone else's thoughts and feelings, and affective empathy, which is the drive to have an emotional response that's appropriate to someone else's thoughts and feelings. And what I'm going to argue, and what I do in my book, is to argue that it's particularly the latter. It's when we lose our affective empathy that we become capable of extremes of cruelty. The other important concept in my book is this idea that empathy lies on a bell curve in the population. So we all have it. Most of us are in the middle with average levels of empathy. Some people are above average. Maybe we'll come back to that. But some people are below average. And the book explores what are the social and biological factors that could cause somebody to be way down on the left of this distribution with low empathy. And, you know, historically, many people have pointed to social factors. So, for example, the terrorists that flew the plane into the Twin Towers at 9/11 must have been in the grip of an ideology, a belief system that they were doing the right thing. And they may also have been in the grip of in-group, out-group relations where they believed that their group was better than the other. Stanley Milgram's famous experiments at Yale University referred to a different kind of social factor that could cause you to lose your empathy, which was obedience to authority, that if somebody in a white coat tells you to administer electric shocks, you might follow orders just because this is an authority figure. And John Bowlby here in the UK, who was a pediatrician, he placed a lot of weight on what he called early attachment, the importance of children feeling loved and valued by their caregivers, and that in the absence of that, such as in conditions of neglect or abuse, kids may grow up, for example, to show antisocial behavior, delinquency. So these are all examples of social factors that could erode your empathy. But we know that social factors are not the whole story, because research certainly is implicating genetics in how much empathy you end up with. This is work from Avshalom Caspi showing that certainly if you've experienced childhood maltreatment, that increases your likelihood of antisocial behavior, such as delinquency in your teens. But if you're carrying one version of this gene, the MAOA gene, that also increases your risk of delinquency even further. So genes and environment interact. In our work, we've looked at a hormone, testosterone, prenatally, which shapes brain development, and we've been able to measure that during pregnancy and then follow up babies, and found that kids who had lower levels of prenatal testosterone, when you measure their empathy on this test of looking at eyes and picking out which word best describes what someone is thinking or feeling, there's a negative correlation. So hormonal factors may also be contributing to how much empathy a person ends up with. And that could explain the gender differences that we see on the eyes test. So this is really a test of recognizing other people's thoughts and feelings. And across 57 different countries, we conducted this big online experiment with 300,000 participants. We find robust gender differences, that women on average score higher than men at being able to recognize what someone else is thinking or feeling. And this also is associated with differences in brain activity, particularly in the inferior frontal gyrus, just one of many brain regions involved in empathy. Autistic people are also a group that we have studied, and they struggle with empathy. But I want to point out, and I make this argument in the book, that autistic people are almost the mirror opposite of psychopaths. Autistic people struggle with cognitive empathy, recognizing people's facial expressions, for example. And as a result, they tend to avoid social situations and withdraw into the world of objects, which are more predictable. But they do have intact affective empathy. When they hear that someone else is suffering, it upsets them and they want to do something about it. Psychopaths, I would argue, are the opposite. They have intact cognitive empathy. That's how they're able to manipulate another person. They're able to anticipate what someone else might be thinking or feeling. They can deceive on that basis, and they know what will cause another person pain. But they've got reduced affective empathy, that they just don't care about their victims' thoughts and feelings. I want to end, because I want to stay on time, with just a question about people who are at the other end of this empathy bell curve. People who have average or above average empathy, and to argue that empathy is really a natural human resource for conflict resolution. And the images you can see in the center of this screen come from the successful resolution of one conflict, apartheid in South Africa, when these two men, de Klerk and Mandela, formed a relationship based on empathy and respect for each other, then the conflict ended. And I would argue that we are in the midst of many conflicts even today, but empathy can play a major role in conflict resolution. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Simon.